record audio, and then I will kick off the show after 3 seconds of silence. Welcome to the Quality Under Pressure podcast, a podcast that reminds you that a conversation is still a beautiful thing. My name is Min, joined by my co host Scott, and today we are speaking with Jinhee, who I met through a mutual friend and because of this podcast. And Jinhee was on back in episode 41, where we talked about the experiences of Asian American men. And I think that was the only episode where we had three guests. So you didn't get to speak a whole lot, but I'm excited to give you a little bit of more space today. And we invited Jinhee on because he is a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota working in epidemiology. And I think a lot of media sources are trying to get researchers and experts on their show, and we happen to get the best one. So, how are you today, Jinhee?
And I'm doing really good. And I'm a PhD student technically, and my field is in social epidemiology. So in contrast to things like infectious epidemiology, like coronavirus, my research is specifically in cancer epidemiology in immigrant and refugee communities. So I'm not the expert per se, but we do use the same tools, methods, and just I guess code of conducts that all epidemiologists use.
That's great. I wanted to ask you what was your focus because I assumed um, you could probably like epidemiology is vast. And so I was going to ask you like, what was the specific thing that you focus on, which you've answered. But could you even explain what that is sort of in your own words? Because I think a lot of people are watching the news and hearing those words and like this person is this expert and this is their field. But what does it mean to you in your own words, other than it makes you sound really fancy these days?
It's kind of funny because when I tell people that I study epidemiology, they think I study skin diseases. And the reason why they think that is because epi, I think it stands for everywhere or so. But the actual, well, the way I would describe epidemiology is that it's the study of the transmission, prevalence, and the spread of diseases. And when we talk about diseases, we're not just talking about the coronavirus or Zika or whatever infectious virus that you can think of. We're also talking about things like gun violence, cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, things that you might not necessarily associate as diseases, but still have dramatic health outcomes with. And so, more specifically, my research is in something called ethnic enclaves. And ethnic enclaves is how think of diverse, concentrated communities, something like Chinatown, and how ethnic enclaves are either protective against certain cancers or yeah, think of it that way.
Yeah. How many different sort of subfields can we fray it out into? Like you said, like you focus more on a certain population. There are all sorts of different diseases that you can break it out into. Like I would assume like obesity is another major thing that people look into. Like how many different ways can you break this field into? I am sure it's endless, but
To be honest, I have no idea. I think it really can be endless. Just off the top of my head, there's infectious, social, environmental, global, um, maybe clinical is its own separate thing. Um,
yeah.
I was reading the Wikipedia page on epidemiology
Attaboy. Attaboy.
before we had it, just because I was trying to do my background research on and just talking about just branching it out. And there's a field called epizoology where they talk
oh yeah,
about the spread of diseases through animals and plants, right? So epidemiology is really focused on human to human transmission. Am I correct there, Jinhee? But
yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
there's an entire field dedicated to how things spread between all living things.
Mhm. And
Yeah.
I know that our friends in the zoology department at the U are also very, very busy on learning about the I think the biology of coronavirus. And so that's a field that I have absolutely no knowledge of anything biological. It's way over my head, but yeah, I
Yeah.
think you nailed it.
Um, so you are currently in class right now, right? You're taking online courses, right?
Yep.
And one thing we touched on kind of before we got into this was, given that you're in classes and you're taking these online courses, and there's so much influence coming from the University of Minnesota, could you just kind of briefly touch on, what's being done at the U of M right now in terms of any kind of trials and just any kind of reference that you're getting in class right now as to like a live case study?
hmm So I guess the two trials that I know of off the top of my head is first with the hydroxychloroquine trials, made famous by Donald Trump, of course. And also we have the antibody trials, I think.
Okay.
I'm not exactly sure what's going on there, but that's happening at the U. Also, the University of Minnesota is working on a novel screening test for coronavirus, just because we don't want to take away screening supplies from the national level. So we're developing our own screening tool for that. And I heard that it's actually going really well. We're seeking funding from the national government and also from MDH and Minnesota. So hopefully that goes well. Just because at the current rate of screening that we're going through right now, we're going to have to triple our screening rates just to see if we can even open the state back up by May 4th.
Oh
Hmm.
wow. See,
Mhm.
like that's something that like did you know that, Scott? Like that's what I'm saying. Like Ginny will know a lot more of like these little details. Cause like to hear you say like we're gonna need to ramp it up to know if we can even open the state up by May 4th. Like here I am like crossing my fingers like, oh, like May 4th, am I gonna be able to play basketball again? Like to hear you say that, that's a big no. Don't even think about it.
Well, well, it could happen. Compared to other states, Minnesota's public health department is actually pretty top notch. I think we're really lucky that we have a governor that's uses and appreciates sciences and uses science and like has a you know pretty big priority on using the sciences for its policies. And it might happen, but again, these are moving dates. The virus sets its own course, and ultimately, it also depends on like if people could actually stay inside. And given the recent protests, um, we really don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen that too, and I have to give applause to Tim Walls. Again, I feel like he really trusts and leans on the information coming from the University of Minnesota in his addresses, and it's really empowering seeing him kind of lean on that data and just trust it, and then be able to communicate it to the layman and in an efficient way, and back up why he's making his actions, right? I
Yeah.
think a lot of people in Minnesota see something like that, and we understand, and we're a lot more cooperative. I say all that with obviously protesters knocking on his door, um, but I think that's another discussion as to understanding why we're not working right now, right?
hmm
Just to really touch on the University of Minnesota, I believe the biomedical research department made a low cost ventilator. They invented what they called a coventer. It's the size of a cereal box at a low cost. So again, a lot of really cool things coming out of this state in terms of influence, not only nationally but probably around the world, right?
Yeah, definitely. Coming into the U, I had no idea how much of an influence we actually had, and
Hmm.
um, and I think being a PhD student's really given me more appreciation for the state of Minnesota. I mean, of course, there's a lot of work that we still need to do, but I don't want to shit on any of the southern states, but we're doing a pretty good job right now.
And to hear you say that too, I've always heard like, when I applied for the University of Minnesota for undergrad and for graduate school, and every time you do, they make their pitch like, we're a top 10 research school. The specific college that I went to, the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, like when I was entering it, it was a top 10 public policy school in the nation. So they pitch all these things, and to hear you say that and reinforce it and sort of make it a little bit more real for us, like we should be very proud that we have this sort of at least nationally renowned university, maybe even world renowned university right in our backyard. That's really cool to think about.
Yeah,
Well,
definitely. I'm happy to be here.
and just to kind of pile on top of that too, think about all the biomedical industry that's built around the Twin Cities, from St. Jude Medical to Boston Scientific to Medtronic, and obviously 3M with the masks. And there was some debate there, but I know like Tesla was doing some awesome kind of cooperative work with, I believe it was Medtronic, trying to make ventilators, right? And the cooperation and coordination there.
There are
Um,
two
Yeah,
points that you guys
definitely.
made that I want to highlight, and before we get to the speed round, but I'll give you guys time to respond if you guys have it. When you guys were talking about Governor Walz, I think that's the points that the points that you guys were making were very important. Like that's I really do feel like, you want a leader to have the humility to sort of hand off decision making and to like, coming from like a creative space, you definitely want a director that gives you as maybe the sound engineer or the director of photography or whatever, gives you the space to do the work that you need to do properly. So to have a leader that has the humility to say like, hey, this might be something I'm not an expert on. This might be something I don't know enough about. So let's turn to the experts and draw from what they're telling us, and maybe it'll be my position and my responsibility to sort of make high level decisions based off of the information that they're feeding me. Like that's to me the type of leader that you want. So when you guys were sort of applauding the governor, I think, you know, I don't know, like I don't know if he's doing everything right. Like I'm just not in that position, but definitely the things that we sort of highlighted, I think we have to give him credit for.
Yeah, yeah, completely agree with that.
mhm.
Also, the field that you're in, Ginny, like, is that the field that is closest to like informing public policy? Because I'm thinking, like the medical field is very vast, but like I can't imagine like someone that's working directly in cancer research. Like I just feel like there's a much bigger gap between that and like what we tell like from a government standpoint tell the public. Like is epidemiology, is that where like people turn to for like public health advice? Is that the primary field?
Um, excuse me. That's an interesting question. Sometimes
Yeah, yeah.
it depends. Um, for example, during my master's culminating project was to survey cigarette prices across Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so to do that, I worked with a nonprofit organization called the Association of Non-Smokers of Minnesota. And I imagine that type of work where I have to figure out what the average tobacco product prices are could inform policy. But at the same time, a lot of epi research is very theoretical.
Mm,
Like, for instance, my current research right now, I'm looking at protective factors for cancer in ethnic communities.
Hmm.
And that could be a very, very abstract paper. It's probably going to involve some really jargony models and everything. And I can't imagine that becoming policy straight away. But the hope is maybe another epidemiologist or another researcher could use that model to figure out, what are some of the things that we should look out for in communities and how can we actually, influence or like help these communities thrive.
that's
And
really interesting.
so, yeah, I feel like epidemiology is closer to that, I guess, influence hierarchy in public health or in policy, but it's still, depending on your research, it can still be very far off.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
again,
and
they still have to listen to you.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up like the theoretical end of all this, and I think that ties in perfectly well with what's going on with all these forecasting efforts. And I know there's a lot of debate and controversy over right now over the models that are being used for the mortality and the spread. And I think what's really interesting, and we can dive deeper into this if you really want to, but we got to get the science right, because the science is driving policy, and the policy that's based on all these models are basically the most important tool as to whether we're really saving this thing and we're making the right direction, right? So it's definitely interesting trying to read into the models and what factors are being rolled into them and the possible, question marks as to, are we doing this science right, and are we doing the statistics right, and the debate between that community.
Hmm.
But
And yeah, now that you brought up models, actually, our professors get a lot of crap because, first of all, the public thinks that these models are going to be super accurate,
right.
and of course, it changes over time. And looking at just some of the Facebook comments of or just like random Reddit comments of some past models, people are saying things like "All hail the mighty model," "Never question the model," or something like that, as if it was something that was set in stone. But like you said, these models are incredibly complex, and oftentimes the researchers and the professors are being tapped to make these models just 2 days before. I think the initial model for coronavirus or COVID-19 was the White House tapped two Harvard professors to map out a model for the entire nation, and they wanted the model done by 2 days. And if you know exactly what goes in the model, it's absolutely ridiculous to ask for that time frame of 2 days. So it's yeah, it's yeah, I don't want to like make it sound like excusey and whatever, but
No,
it's
let's
it's
dive
hard.
into that a little bit. Let's talk about the factors that go into forecasting, right? And why forecasting is so challenging, especially from a statistical approach and under time, right? What I'm reading, and this could be wrong, and I'm just kind of loosely following this on Twitter, so just please like take what I'm saying in verbatim and don't feel bad if you correct me at all. But I think the problem right now is the sensitivity of the data that is being driven into these models is protected. And I think there's an outcry right now as to statisticians around the world that would like an open source approach to this data where they can make their own models and compare it to what's being released. And when that information is closed and captured in a private forum, it's hard to really analyze, and who knows who's right, it could be wrong. But that's the main kind of focal point of what I'm seeing around the debate around the models right now. Any comment on that, Jinhee?
I don't know how I feel about an open source model. But to give you guys some perspective about what goes in these models, here's a really simple mental game that you can play. So the actual fatality rates, or for the coronavirus, it can be thought of as three different things. First, the fatality. So if you get coronavirus, will you die? The second could be the infection rate. So among a or like what are your chances of getting infected? And then finally, third, you have the susceptible population. And so you have these three different variables. But on top of these three different variables, there are other sub factors that go into each of these variables. So here's a I guess a quick question. What do you guys think goes inside of the fatality rate for coronavirus?
Death. I would guess testing, right? Whether they have it or not. And then cause of death, right? Is it a pneumonia-related death, which can be strongly correlated to the coronavirus, right? Because there could be confounding data there if someone has a heart attack but has coronavirus. And then I would say they're probably analyzing age as a factor. Um,
Yeah.
and then geography, maybe. And this is kind of, I think I tried to touch on the main factors there with the fatality rate, but um,
Hmm. And so I would also add things that increase or modify your chances of dying from coronavirus. So,
mhm.
for example, for some reason we don't know yet, males tend to die more because of coronavirus than females. if you're a smoker, you tend to have a higher fatality rate. And
Mm.
of course, like you said, if you're older, you have more higher chance of dying. And for a lot of these different factors, we simply don't know yet.
Hmm.
Another factor that goes into these models that a lot of people don't think about is what's our hospital capacity. So if you have hospitals that are truly adequately resourced and have enough hospital beds and ventilators, then you're less likely to die. And this changes by state, even county by county, city by city. And so that's why it's very, very hard to tap a couple of people and say, we want a model for the entire nation. And we
And then you
want
could
this
drill
model.
down into the hospitals even more to say, do we have the ventilators in this hospital, right? Because
Exactly. Yeah.
you could be, you could be medicalized in a hospital with not enough resources, but then still die about it. And that I'm glad you brought that up because that's another topic of debate. You guys follow Nate Silver? He's like a big forecaster,
Oh, yeah.
statistic modeler. And he's saying a big problem here is that are we modeling the right thing? We're trying to understand transmission rate and susceptibility, where he's arguing that, based on if I'm reading this tweet right, like we should be modeling the hospital capacities and because that's the ultimate bottleneck in all this. That's the flex point as to whether it becomes fatal or not, as to monitoring the hospital rates, right? Um, where I think he's saying we might not even be tracking the right thing in these models, right?
I think it's certainly possible. But again, it's really, really hard because every state probably has their own different variation of the model. But from my understanding of what goes into these models, hospital capacity and beds, ventilators are one crucial thing that goes into every single one of these models. So
Mm.
I don't know exactly what the U of M model looks like, but I would be very surprised if some of the factors that we said weren't included.
Ginny, can I ask you this too? Like, since we're speaking of models, and I did some of this stuff in graduate school, but from a public policy lens. And so, like, yes, you can build models, you can change one variable at a time to sort of tweak things and figure things out too. But from like a statistical standpoint too, there's the power of numbers, but the data that we plug into the models that we build also has a large impact, at least when I sort of studied this. Is that the same for you guys too? And because this is happening real time, I'm thinking about the different data sets that people in your field might have to work with. And so as data begins to come in and you begin to plug them into certain models, like how reliable is that? Because the data is always changing.
That's another huge debate that we're having right now at the U. And so, one thing, when we first started modeling for coronavirus, I should really say SARS-CoV-2, just because our professors want us to call it by that,
Oh,
but I'm sure you
perfect.
guys know what I'm saying.
Is so
Um,
Yeah,
that's the actual
SARS-CoV-2.
technical term that we should be using then.
yes, in academia, that's
Okay.
the term that they want us to use. So when we first started modeling for SARS-CoV-2, we're heavily relying on data from China, Wuhan, China, where the epicenter was,
Right.
and sometimes in South Korea and so on. The problem is that we don't know exactly how reliable some of the testing that they're doing. And we don't know if the hospital infrastructure is actually, if we don't know if we can actually trust that data 100%.
Hmm.
And so I was actually reading an article from researchers in Wuhan, China, and they're saying that a certain test had a false negative rate of about 30% or so. And so again, that's problematic just because a false positive rate would say that among people who test um, positive, oof,
Yep.
I'm getting
Don't
terminology.
actually have it.
Yeah, they don't have it or something like that. And
And 30%
interesting,
seems very high, right?
yeah. But I
For
should also
a error.
mention that that study was redacted. And so we don't
Huh.
know what the true false positive or false negative positive predictive values of these tests are. And so that's another reason why the University of Minnesota wants to create their own test, just because we can more accurately say, if our tests are actually valid.
Hmm.
Um,
Which is kind of a bummer because, like you're saying, like if we can use the data that they've collected already, and it seemed like a reliable source of data, um, well, South Korea is probably in the same position as we are, but China had more time to collect more data, and like we're still kind of in the middle of this. So if the data that we're getting from China happen to be more reliable, um, I think it's a it could have been a more robust data set.
Well,
Yeah.
and you take a look at the just the law of large numbers, right? A larger sample size is going to give you a more approximation to the true norm or to the true mean. And I think the problem is with the unfortunate unreliability of the Chinese case. I think you're still taking on a risk with a U of M trial because the sample size is so much smaller. Would you agree with that, Jinhee? Is like that's one drawback, even though you are dictating. Uh,
I
and
don't know actually.
I guess that's all on the. I think there's factors in the design of experiments with how you model that trial to get to kind of any degree of freedom with your range of error and what's acceptable and not, right?
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, at the end of the day, we're always gonna have a certain degree of uncertainty, or
right.
we're not gonna be 100% sure that our tests are accurate, but it's still the best tool that we have. And so, for example, you could only test high risk populations, so then that we have a greater chance of knowing if they're actually sick. Or you could do tests multiple times on people. That's a pretty standard practice. Just so if you get a false negative or a false positive, we know for sure. I mean, your chances reduce of a test being inaccurate if you're taking the test
Right.
multiple times. And so there's these little tools that epidemiologists and healthcare professionals can use, but we're always going to have a degree of uncertainty, unfortunately.
Hmm.
Yeah, I want to reinforce that too, like especially from what I learned at graduate school, like just you know, there's always going to be human bias that's involved, and so like you can't have an airtight sort of theoretical model, and then like when it comes to applying it in real world context, like there's always going to be some sort of application barriers too, and so like there's always error introduced to all of this, and so you do the best that you can, but you always have to look at whatever results are produced with the skeptical eye, I think.
Mhm. And speaking of data, it's in epidemiology and statistics, valid data is king. And so without valid data, we like to say that we can't make any inferences about anything.
Trash
And
in, trash
so
out, right?
yeah, exactly.
If you put in bad data, you're going to get a bad model. So,
Mhm. And so like another example why data is so important is because did you guys hear that ibuprofen is supposedly supposed to make your case worse or something like that?
yeah,
I
I
did,
read that.
yes.
Well, it turns out that that statement had absolutely no data to back it up,
Huh.
and people were saying that who
Hmm.
said that ibuprofen makes coronavirus worse. However, without actual valid data, that statement means nothing. And actually, I think literally 2 days later, they redacted that statement and said that
Yeah.
they have no, you know, there is no evidence to say that
And
ibuprofen does anything.
that was a headline on CNN. I
Yeah,
remember reading that. I'm like, CNN's running this. I remember reading the article, and that they said they danced around the not backed by data. They didn't use
mhm.
those words. They said ibuprofen could, like just threw in like a hypothetical word, but then wrote the rest of the article just kind of assuming that ibuprofen was factually, making these COVID cases worse.
And
Um,
this is actually what infuriates me with medicine and public health sometimes is because that's the same logic that anti-vaxxers use. They're saying that there is this biological link and that like there's no data on it. However, they're making this assertion and suddenly CNN has to say both sides.
mhm.
And so people saying that ibuprofen makes coronavirus worse uses the same logic of anti-vaxxers saying vaccines cause autism. And this is why I think that We don't need intermediary sources like CNN or whatever fancy pop science news outlet telling us what to do. Just go straight to CDC, MDH, WHO, and I think we ought to be more chill that way.
I want to reinforce what you
Yeah.
said too, because it's so like you've said after all of this sort of misinformation that whoever produced it, whoever distributed it has redacted it. And I feel like at that point when you say like they redacted it, the public, the average person's response is, oh well, they were responsible enough to redact it. Okay, case closed, like they did their part. But it doesn't end there. Like especially like when I think about the anti-vax movement, all of that, like the person that produced those results put it out there,
Lost their license.
lost their
He lost his
license,
life.
it got
Yeah.
distributed, but like if he lost his license and that's where it ended, that would be one thing. That's where I think like if that
Hmm.
were the actual real world scenario, then we could sort of just brush our hands off and be like, okay, the guy redacted it, he lost his license, we're good to go. But we're still dealing with the ramifications of that anti-vax narrative. And so it's just, to me, it's once you poison the well, like it's the cleanup process is 10 times magnitudes more difficult. And so to say like, oh, this source put out some misinformation and it was amplified by our news outlets, and one day we decided like we're gonna redact it, like that's not good enough. And I don't
No,
know what the correction is, like what is the penalty mechanism that we can put into place, but it's dangerous and it's not good enough.
especially for something like the coronavirus right now. We need, yes, we need information to be distributed as quickly as possible. But the research that's being produced right now is often not peer reviewed. We don't have enough
Yeah.
time to actually read through it. And at the moment, sometimes we just have to trust it. And, being in academia myself, I'm not sure if I would even trust myself in like accurate research. And so it's tough. I feel like as academics, we're more, sure we learn a lot, but there's the more you learn, the more you're kind of uncertain about everything you produce, and it's kind of a double-edged sword.
That's the paradox, but that's the correct response. And I think the humble response is like the more you know, the more that's revealed that of the things that you don't know. And so like I don't know, I'm just thinking of like just different quotes and adages about like ignorance, and like it's nice to just be like in your own bubble, and stupidity, and all of that. But just like yeah, you're right, the more you know, the more you double clutch and hesitate and think about all the things you don't know.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
uh
it's really frustrating being in this field sometimes, but hopefully something good could come out of it.
but you have to
Yeah.
keep it in perspective too, like yeah, like that is the sort of paradox that we fall into. But um, if you think about the overall line that moves, you are progressing, you are adding knowledge, and you're contributing, and especially during a time like this where everyone is looking towards your field for guidance. Well, every reasonable person is looking towards your field for guidance. Um, you are contributing, and even like you're saying like that's not my specific field within my field, but you sort of have the mechanisms and the methodology that you can kind of share with us.
Yeah, if you put it in that way, I feel very important now. So thank you.
Good, good, good.
Well, and I think what's unfortunate is that the small percentage of the anti-vaxxer communities and the pseudoscience, they have louder voices, I think, than the reasonable, norm, um, which
Hmm.
unfortunately get heard more. Um, so I think I'm with Min there that again, there's a lot of reasonable and rational people that again do rely on your field for kind of guidance and the understanding there.
Also, I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
the fight is uphill for people like Ginny and people in academia, because you guys are now plucking um, the fruit that's high. The low-hanging fruit is easy. Like the common everyday person, if somebody comes to them with like an anti-vax message or something like that, that's really easy to grab onto. It's low-hanging fruit, and so you hear it once and you're like, oh yeah, I even I can connect those dots. But the stuff that you're working on and the stuff that your colleagues are working on, it's a lot more difficult for people like me and the common day person to understand. And so it takes time for you to understand that, and people aren't willing to invest that. So it's easy to brush off. It's probably more true, but it's easy to brush off. And so people tend to cling to the low-hanging fruit.
Mm,
Hmm. Yeah, and I feel like nowadays, I also think it's partly because science is so inaccessible right now. Um, as we learn more, our models are becoming more abstract, and the methods that we use are becoming more harder to explain. And I think
mm,
there's a little bit of a backlash from the public community. They want very simple, interpretable science. Like,
mhm.
I think this has to do with flat earthers, for example. I think the reason why they think the earth is flat is because it just makes sense. Like, and they don't need fancy scientific models to explain that. But of course, it's the fancy scientific models and the methods that we use to say that the earth is round. And so I think we're
To
experiencing the same thing
empirically
with epidemiology.
to empirically prove that it is round. To
Yeah,
show like hard evidence that it is.
yeah.
Um,
So it's tough.
But to me, that's like when I agree with everything you're saying, so I don't want to make it sound like, I'm pushing back against that, but like to me that's so disappointing. To me that is like a backlash against evolution. Like human beings have evolved to be able to think in the abstract, to think theoretically. And so we have a
mhm.
brain that bypasses my personal experience. Oh, when I walk on the earth, it seems flat, but we have evolved in a way where we can say like, okay, like that is, yes, that is my personal experience, but that is not the objective truth. And so to hear that, there's a population that, because of their personal experience, they're not able to get to a scientific understanding. Man, that I don't know. I think it's true. I think what you're saying again is true, but it's so disappointing and it's like such a slap to the face of human evolution.
Yeah, unfortunately it is, and it's I don't know how to like actually counteract that. It's
Yes.
to be honest, I feel like some people are just so far gone that there's very little that you can do except work on the people who would actually listen. And there's a whole another field for that on how to actually interpret science to make it more accessible.
Yeah.
But it's another huge problem that we have.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I take a look at the example of just early on when we were explaining why we need to social distance, right? The media's effort to educate the population on exponential growth. Again, as a PhD student, I'm sure that's just so basic for you, but I have to imagine someone outside of the sphere of math and science. It was kind of a reality check for me to be like, oh, the a lot of the population doesn't know kind of basic like high school math, right? Like
Yeah, yeah,
and
exactly.
driving that message across, you know, as to
Mhm.
explaining why we need to stay at home.
Yeah, I've
That's
thought
what
Yeah,
I think the protesters aren't understanding, right?
I've thought about
They're
that
lacking
too.
that basic. Sorry, go ahead.
And kind of thinking about the last point that we made about, how do we make science and math and education accessible? Like I was thinking about the solution and sort of psychological barriers. And so like, when people go on TV and they talk about the exponential rate of growth, with a situation like this, they all think about the actual numbers that they say out loud. They go 2, 4, 8, 16, and then they stop. And so like when people
Right,
hear like,
right.
oh, like 16 cases of COVID-19, not that bad, but they don't
Mhm.
understand that, extrapolate that
The
10 days
inflection
out,
point, right?
hmm,
and you don't realize like how fast that grows.
Mhm.
exactly. Yeah,
And so I think they're like, yes, there's, we've failed to educate people, but there are weird psychological barriers that, we're not thinking about when we're delivering these messages. And is that, I'm trying to think of the field, like there's epidemiology. Is this epistemology that I'm thinking about?
it might be. I
Hmm.
have no idea.
There's so many ologies.
Mhm.
Um,
And so, yeah, I'm sorry.
no, 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 please go.
Um, And I think with epidemiology in particular, we focus. I think this goes for all sciences, but we always hang around with people like us. Like I have a lot of academic friends in academic circles, and most of my friends have college degrees. But that's not the case if you go out to more rural Minnesota, more rural
Yeah.
communities, or even more diverse communities. So even for people like me, we don't know exactly what those other communities are going through or what their level of comprehension is. And I don't mean to talk down on these communities at all, but it's just that people like me, we lost touch of what it feels like to um, not have the tools of inference that we do now. And so there's I can't help but think that when people are talking about the liberal elites, and this is exactly what they're talking about. They're talking about people like me who they tell other people what to do, what's best for them, and you can't help but think that. Am I making sense?
Oh, you're making
it's
Yeah.
total sense.
Yeah.
It's resonating with me so hard
yeah,
because I'm thinking about my circles too, and
Mhm.
it's disheartening because what transpires isn't intentional. Like, when I'm thinking
right.
about
No.
my liberal circle of friends and my graduate circle of friends, the intention is we can't leave rural Minnesota behind. We can't leave, people that are at a high school level of education behind. And again, like you said, I don't mean that with judgment. I just mean that with observation. And so, like, we're thinking about those things, but it's just like, day to day, everyone's busy, or like the forces of academia or the forces of society that, push us or rush us in a certain way, or, sort of build in systemic limitations. Like, we have every intention to. That's like a core value of like whether it's the liberal elite or academia or whatever. That's actually a core value to be inclusive and to bring everyone in and to share that knowledge. It's just, I
Mhm.
don't know, in practice, it just doesn't happen that way, and that's disheartening and frustrating.
But what
Yeah.
is encouraging is, you guys are recognizing it, right? How much of the college educated just kind of just jumps to conclusions, and I think the word I want to use here is like to have the intellectual humility to have perspective of someone who is not as intelligently gifted or has not had the privilege of going through the same kind of course of education that we have, right? So I think that's the first step is being cognizant and understanding um, that you're not any better because you have a college degree and you can hold more education over this other person's head. And again, I think the hand needs to be reached out and we need to use that in a positive force,
Mhm.
rather than instead of divide, right?
Yeah.
Um, but
I think
I
you
don't want
hit
to
it.
get too
Yeah.
soapboxy. I don't want to get too soapboxy and preach on this just because I know the political state is just ugly, but I think that's definitely a pressing issue, and that's I think what you guys are talking about is kind of really circling around that core.
Yeah. Well, you had a follow-up to that, Ginny?
Um, Forgot what I was gonna
Yeah, that
say.
happens to me all the time too. Okay. I want to ask you one more thing, and I do kind of want to turn to sort of your personal experience with what's the academic term that you guys are using for COVID-19?
SARS-CoV-2.
SARS-CoV.
SARS-CoV-2.
Mhm.
Okay. But just back to your field. It seems like it's a pretty interdisciplinary field. Would that be kind of true, you think?
Yeah, exactly. The reason why I chose epidemiology instead of biostatistics is because I have a really deep love and passion for social justice, but I also really wanted to stick with the STEM sciences,
Mm.
particularly statistics and biostatistics. And so, what I love about epidemiology is that you can use your knowledge of sociology, maybe biology, and incorporate your own interest to it. Like, for example, I have a really strong interest in social justice, social inequities, and stuff like that. And I can incorporate my knowledge of biostatistics, maybe a little bit of biology, a little bit of chemistry into epidemiology. again, epidemiology is more grounded in statistics and these models and whatever, but you could still put in whatever. And like I said before, epidemiology, you need to know what goes into these models. Like, and one example that I like to think of is how do you model something like racism?
Hmm.
And so, you could throw whatever numbers you want. And so, a biostatistician might think that things that go into racism are um, maybe. Well, let me phrase this carefully because this can get really ugly.
Yes, yes.
Could you quantify it in terms of uh, demographics with low income housing in areas and segment it like that? Is that a
Right.
way to
Yep. Those would be a
You
approach
could
couple
it?
of variables for sure that you would throw into the model.
definitely do that. So let's say that they want to. Again, I'm not a biostatistician, so I don't mean to like shit on them right now. But a lot of the difference between epidemiology and biostatistics, in my opinion, is that epidemiology, you're more grounded into the causal mechanisms. So, for example, is this variable or is this risk factor a modifier or a mediator between two different variables? And so while a biostatistician might create a complex model and then say whatever residual variation is left, we'll attribute that to racism.
Hmm.
But epidemiologists might say something like, we're not looking at the full picture here. Or
Hmm.
what's the context and what's the environment that we're looking at? How was this data pulled? And how did we conduct our experiments? So I think biostatistics is a little bit more grounded in numbers and theory, but epidemiology is more grounded in the social realities of what people actually go through. And we use numbers to interpret that, if that
It
makes sense.
it almost sounds more casual as to what you were mentioning as to attributing racism to a residual factor on the back end, right? As the result.
Mm-hmm.
Am I
Yeah, and
understanding that correctly?
yeah, basically.
Okay.
And I'm sorry to anybody who doesn't know what that is, but it's this is another example of like academics thinking like they don't know how to like simplify things. Um, but yeah, I think you're right, man. It's really more just looking at everything, I guess, and that's what I love about epidemiology.
Yeah, but at the same time, like you apologize for not being able to simplify it, but sometimes it's not simple. Like there's a you have to have a certain baseline of understanding, and that's why, when we think about coming from a public policy sphere, like when we think about, is higher education affordable and things like that, like we have to, like I think, going through more advanced statistics, like our data literacy is so poor. And so like to be able to talk about things that you're trying to get across and to again, we want to bring in the general population into this conversation, but without being equipped with certain skills, like how do you
Mhm.
talk about some of these advanced ideas? And I don't know, like we definitely, like, the people that are privileged enough to go to higher education have to take some of the blame, but I don't know, at the same time, like the system fails people too.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
Um, I was also talking with someone recently about the education system currently in the United States, and I have mixed feelings about this. So I agree. There's a lot of we're not teaching enough in the STEM sciences and so on. But I also think that there's so much more. There's a lot of importance in just teaching empathy and teaching people, the social sciences. And hopefully, this is my own personal opinion. It has not. It's not reflective of the U of M epidemiology department or anything. But I think with the STEM sciences, you can get lost in the numbers, and you could think that these numbers are facts, and you can think that how should I phrase this? Like you can lose sight of what's really important in your research by focusing solely on the theoretical number side of research.
Hmm.
But academics like me, hopefully, the goal is to improve the lives of other people. And I think in epidemiology, biostatistics, and whatever field you're in, you can lose sight of that and want to solely focus on making a name for yourself, like publications and so on.
Getting the PhD, you
Getting that
know,
Right.
grant.
passing.
Yeah.
Right.
Unfortunately, and that's just the way our system is set right now. So
Yeah.
I forgot what the original question is.
No,
Sorry.
but I think you're
So
right. I think you're right. Like that's why I think having more interdisciplinary tracks matters
yeah,
because you don't get so narrowed into a thing and you think
that's
about.
exactly what.
Yep,
Mhm.
that's what I was hearing from you too. And so it's just like, like to open up and to be able to think about, okay, like this is what I'm working on, but I also learned this skill in the social sciences and political science and all of that, and to be able to incorporate all of that. That's why I think, like when I see you, you're you also are this really advanced kickboxer, and I'm just thinking about like like how your time in that field and the discipline that it takes, and all the variables that come with kickboxing, how that shapes the person that you are, and how that probably enhances the academic work that you're doing. It just matters. All the periphery and the other things that you're doing, all of that matters.
Mhm. And speaking of kickboxing, what I really appreciate about that sport is that I'm not surrounded by my liberal elite friends. And
Hmm.
so it brings in a whole group of people that I would normally never have the chance to meet. And
Hmm.
quite frankly, I might not be interested in talking to them in the first place.
Hmm.
But you just have the chance of meeting people who are completely different and who may not be like with the same interest as you, and it helps you realize like you know the academic circles, it's not everything. It's a very very small fraction of the whole community that I actually live in, and it's really helped me open my eyes.
I think that's great, and I think we all get lost in the echo chambers. I don't think it's only limited to the small fraction of academia. I just take a look at my own life and just again, if I'm stuck in the same circle, just how narrow minded I can get. So that's really great that you have that outlet. I just want to really touch on just where I think the public school system failed is I don't I'm angry that it wasn't essential learning that I was taught how to think,
Mm,
right? Or how to be critical, how to analyze things, how to have how to build an argument, but also be civil about it, but also remove my emotions and not ruin friendships over it. How like I just feel like that's such basic stuff, and we'd be in such a better place socially and just across the board if the masses could think for themselves, could you know I think you guys know where I'm getting at.
I
It's
think
just
when I hear you talk about that, that's now I'm hesitating because I'm thinking about, sort of my Korean background too, because I was gonna say that seems like compared to maybe, and I don't know for sure, I didn't go through the education system in Europe, but when you think about that, when you're saying, we were failed to think about, I don't know, maybe some of these soft skills and to be able to think, craft ideas, and haven't have
logic,
and stuff like
right?
that. Like the ethos of our country is what's practical, what's application, and what helps you produce things. And so like even the entire conversation about, you got to go to college because that's going to help you
Yeah,
earn more money. But like think about like half of the degrees that young people are taking. Like I had a communications degree that actually, like going through high school and people telling me like you have to go to college so you can make more money. I got a communications degree. That didn't help me make more money, but like a part of
mhm,
me also doesn't regret it because the skills that I got to like be able to analyze what people are putting into writing or to be able to produce a piece of writing of my own, like that's invaluable to me. It didn't help me make any money, but like I don't know. I still don't feel like that education failed me. Um,
mm,
but at the same time, like when you're saying that, like like Korea, like Ginny, you might know too, like South Korea is almost doubling down on that. Just like thinking about like,
yeah,
how much like math matters and how much education matters, and hagwons in Korea, like you go to school and then you go to school again.
yeah. And yeah, so this is why I have a really deep appreciation for the social sciences.
Hmm.
Well, if you focus solely on math and the STEM sciences, and again, those fields are incredibly important and they're under resourced. However, we lose sights of other fields which honestly like bring life into our communities, like the
Hmm.
arts and social justice fields. And so without those fields, I think you would have more polarization if you only focus on the STEM sciences without regards to the humanities. I graduated with a major in sociology, and I think that was absolutely invaluable for me. I could have majored in math or statistics, and I might have an easier time in epidemiology because my classes are killing me right now. But I think I don't regret a thing about sociology. It's really helped me figure out what's actually important and how to actually use my skills when I'm
Hmm.
talking to people.
Yeah, I love your point about, the arts how and humanities, how it's cyclical, like they inform each other. Like think about all the times science has influenced sci-fi and all the times
Mhm.
sci-fi has influenced science. And so when you think about it that way, like you need both.
Exactly.
And I think I might be going on a tangent here, but I think what we're learning is, and this ties into being kind of arts and humanities, is I think we're learning in the modern day that our emotions and the expression of our emotions have a lot more power and clout than I think we initially thought in like the 1950s, 60s, 70s. And I just take a very singular dive into like just marriages and just psychotherapy and just the emerging research kind of coming out of that and relating to emotions and the display and kind of reflection on emotion.
Hmm.
Am I onto
Yeah.
something there, or am I?
No, yeah.
No, no, you got it.
Um, okay, I know we're at an hour and we haven't got to any of Ginny's COVID-19 personal experiences. Um,
True.
do you guys mind if we take like a quick 2-minute break and then kind of come back and turn to your personal experiences, Ginny?
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, great. I am gonna go use the bathroom for 2 minutes. If you guys need to grab anything, this would be the time to do it. So I will be right back.
Cool.
So I'm gonna
All
do the
right,
same.
see you guys.
Mm.
Get a refill on the whiskey.
I did.
And a boy.
That was a lot.
Dude, that was great, man. It's like
Yeah,
I can't believe that wasn't that's 58 minutes worth of conversation.
I know. Kind of got out there.
Yeah, but we drilled down on some cool concepts too.
Yeah. I pulled up the history on flat Earth.
Oh
Can you
God.
imagine? Imagine being uh, third century BC and trying to empirically prove that the Earth is round based on like geometry and like triangulation and using like the distance to
Of
to the
shadows.
sun. Yeah, yeah, right. And then trying to explain that to you know like a king
Oh God.
who's apparently blessed by God. You know,
A
it's
weird 16-year-old king because his dad died.
yeah.
Oh my God.
Well, I just what blows my. I mean, flat Earth is just so dumb because we literally have pictures of the Earth
Right,
being round.
right.
Like what more do you need than that?
I don't know, man.
I don't know.
I don't know what to
But
tell
again,
people.
but again, that's just my thought of like a reflection and projection of someone being stupid.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
like
All right. You guys ready to kick things off again then?
I'm good.
mhm.
All right. All right. So I realized that we've been talking a lot about academia, and I guess we did kind of get into your opinions, your personal opinions a little bit there, Ginny, but I kind of want to turn the conversation now to sort of your personal experiences during these strange times. But before we do, I realize that we never put you through the speed round question, so this will be in the history of the Quality Under Pressure podcast, the latest speed round questions. And you were part of our other one, but we did it with two other people, so let's do it again really quickly. So you know the drill. Like, don't think too much about it. Kind of first thing that comes to your head. I will kick things off with: do you prefer wheat or white bread?
Um, whole wheat,
Whole wheat.
100%. Yep.
Nice. Multigrain?
Yes,
Yes.
I guess so. I used
Yes.
to work as a baker, and so yeah, multigrain tastes better.
You are a man of many trades, it seems like, Ginny. Are you a morning person or a night person?
100% morning. I'm getting a little sleepy right now.
For real, really?
Yeah, during the normal school year, I would usually wake up at around 6 a.m. Do a little workout, then be in class by 9:30. So
Wow.
I'm up and running by 6.
Okay, well, we'll get you off the line here pretty soon. Would you rather fix someone's car or someone's computer?
Fix?
Yes, fix someone's car or fix someone's computer.
I don't know much about cars, so I'm just gonna have to say computer by default.
Yeah, I'm the same way.
Mhm.
If a bunch of zombie 8-year-olds came after you, how many could you take out with a bat or with your kickboxing skills?
I think if they're just normal 8-year-olds, I'd be okay with just kickboxing. But zombies, are these the slow moving zombies or like the fat?
I imagine they're the fast ones.
Oof. I think anything above 3 with a bat, and I'm dead.
Would you want to live forever?
Absolutely.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Um, I know that's an unpopular opinion, but I think yeah, maybe I'll end up regretting it after a couple thousands of years, but at the moment, yes.
Yep, yep. What is super boring to you?
Um, I don't know. Um,
Which is a kind of a good quality that you can find interest in almost anything.
yeah. Usually, if I'm not learning anything or like being like working on something, I get bored, and so I don't really find a lot of things boring, to be honest.
That's very cool. I think that's a great
Yeah.
quality. Would you rather cure cancer or discover new life on another planet?
New life.
Cool.
I think if we cure cancer, there's going to be another disease that we have to cure.
That's
But
right.
with new life, there's endless possibilities.
I love that. What's your biggest pet peeve?
People who don't do their dishes.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
I,
If you could have any superpower, what would it be?
I just one.
Just one.
I think it would have to be invulnerability or like some type of super healing strength.
Nice. And last one, if you could talk to your high school self, what would you tell yourself?
Don't be so hard on mom. She's having a hard time raising you.
That's nice. That's really kind. Okay, cool. So I want to turn to sort of our traditional COVID-19 questions. And we've always started we started it with a positive one. What has been the best change since the COVID-19 quarantine in your life?
Um, just the fact that I don't have to commute anywhere. Um, Usually I ride my bike and I'm just off wherever, but I just imagine myself riding my bike through the winter that we had to go through just like a couple of days ago. And just the fact that I don't have to commute, that's probably 45 minutes of free time every day. And so that's really nice. Also, just sweatpants every day. It's super comfortable.
So you're 100% remote now for lessons and do you ever have to go on campus for anything?
I might have to if I need to print something, but for the last couple of months, I've never had to. So 100% remote, and in that way, I think I'm super lucky.
That's great. Do you think you're more productive?
It was really hard the first couple of weeks, to be honest. Just because the work home life balance eventually blurs and everything, you don't have boundaries anymore. But after I think about a month or so, I got back into a good routine, and now I feel like my productivity is about the same.
Could you just kind of touch and expand upon the transition from classes in a lecture hall to online classes? Is the platform that's introduced, is it easy to learn? How are your professors teaching? Are they having some hiccups with getting assignments out or teaching virtually? Could you just expand on that?
Mhm. So I'm really lucky because my all my professors have been really accommodating and they're absolutely fantastic. It is a little weird using Zoom to have meetings with our professors because usually after class, if I have questions on homework, I could just walk up to the professor and I know theoretically you can do the same thing. You could just ask the professor a question, but it just feels different. Um, and also, I don't have as much accountability. Like initially, when I started online classes, I would grab a cup of tea, grab a cup of tea, and like listen. And then eventually, my tea would run out. Grab more tea, come back, use the bathroom just because I drank so much tea. And then just that process, I've missed half a class, and you can't do that in like a traditional lecture
Hmm.
setting. And so initially, it was harder to concentrate, but it takes time, and I think I've adjusted completely.
That's great. That's great. I
Mhm.
love your point about, I don't have to, especially in Minnesota, I don't have to make my bike commute through horrible conditions and maybe, slippery roads and all of that. I mean, it saves you a ton of time.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
um, and even my work right now is completely remote. And so the work meetings that we have is a little bit more hectic just because naturally in a work meeting, I have the chance to actually look at the person. So, for example, Scott, I'm looking right at you, but
Hmm.
you can't tell that just because it's a weird camera situation.
Right.
So, if I wanted, for example, Min to talk after me, I would look right at him, which I'm doing right now, but he would have no idea that I just did that. And so
Hmm.
it's a little bit awkward, but we just have to be more clear about ourselves. And
That's a really good point. And Jinhee, we've been that's been a recurring theme about in-person cues and taking body language. But I'm glad you brought up the point of like eye contact, right? How
yeah,
important is eye contact in a face-to-face interaction? Where again, like you bring up, I'm look. I have two monitors here, so I'm looking at my side monitor, and I'm not looking into the eye camera. So it's like, well, where's his focus? Again, there's so much power, I think, to eye contact. So thanks for touching on that.
Dude, and
yeah,
I hope it's sort of an awakening for, I think people take body language cues when like you're at a meeting and you're communicating with people, like eye contact or just like a nod of the head or like, like some people kind of perk up a little bit when they're waiting for someone to wrap up their thought so they can hop in with their point
yeah.
next. And so like
Mhm.
I hope this is like going through Zoom and, ironing different obstacles out is sort of an awakening for people. So when we all go back to like a meeting room and we're all at the same table and we begin to communicate with people, people have been trained or like they're more intentional and not it's not just some passive thing where, all these little cues matter. I'm thinking about, when I'm in meetings and all the different times when women exhibit sort of a cue where they're like, "Hey, I have something to say next," but we slide right over it because, everyone sort of does those body language cues. Now that, that's been interrupted here for a second, and we have to be more aware and intentional about those things. When women exhibit those body language cues, are men going to be more responsive and be like, Linda has something to say, and she's clearly expressing that?
Hmm. Yeah, I was actually talking with someone about that recently, and they were saying that it's much. They think that it's gonna these Zoom meetings in particular is gonna be very like the power disparities in these Zoom meetings are gonna be even more heightened just because we don't have those cues like you mentioned before. And so hopefully, um, the Zoom is convenient and everything, but I think there's nothing that's going to replace actually being present and seeing everybody and using those body cues.
I agree. I agree. Any other really great changes or something that sort of jarred you to realize, like, oh, this is actually kind of nice right now?
I know you're a college student, but have you supported any local business with any good takeout?
No, to be honest, I feel really bad about it. But I
Yeah,
even during pre-quarantine, I never go out to restaurants.
right.
So maybe I should nowadays, I
But at the
guess.
same time, I'm getting to the point where I'm kind of sick of hearing that responsibility fall on the common person. Like, like
Mhm.
it's the average Joe's, it's the $40,000 a year person's job to stimulate local business and the economy. It's just like, how is that our responsibility? Like,
Yeah.
we do that sort of as a byproduct because, like, we people like us sort of enjoy community, we enjoy socializing, we enjoy going out to those places and sort of exploring different things in the neighborhoods that we live in. But it's not our job to stimulate the economy. It's just like that's policymakers and,
Mhm.
people in Congress like to set up certain incentive systems. I don't think, like you're saying, like, I feel guilty about it. I don't think you have to feel guilty about it in the sense that it's your responsibility. Like, we all want to do our best, and that's where some of the guilt comes from. But I'm actually getting to the point where I'm just like, there's so much like messaging on social media about, like, like, go pick up some food or like order takeout, and it's just like, shut up at this point.
Yeah, yeah, I guess you're completely right. Maybe I don't feel too guilty, but more worried about a couple of small businesses that I go to. Like, for example, the gym that I go to regularly for kickboxing or Muay Thai. It's a small family business. And so they're actually pretty worried about the situation right now. I was talking to another friend whose mom owns another small business, and it's really tough for them out there, especially because there was something in the CARES Act that granted small businesses loans. I think it was called the PPP loan or something like that. I'm gonna miss up the acronym, but apparently that loan completely dried out, and so small businesses no longer have a good, like affordable loan that they can turn to, and so I'm not really worried about that. Like maybe some of these small businesses some of the ones that I do go to, aren't going to be here in a couple of months, and that's pretty concerning to me.
That's a great point. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because I probably sounded like such a huge asshole
No,
with
no,
like,
you make sense. You're completely right.
but like,
I don't, yeah.
we all have those concerns.
Mhm.
Yep, yep. Um, okay, let's go to the second sort of question here for your personal COVID-19 experiences. What has been the toughest change on you?
I don't. Oh, I never realized how extroverted I am. Like usually I go to my routine and I like talk to a few people, maybe meet someone new every day. But now that I'm home every day, I keep wanting to see people. And if that's going to the gym or like meeting a new person, and now I have to maybe make plans for the future, or who knows how far that's going to be. And I'm really lucky because I hang out with my roommates and like my sister's crashing at my place for a while. And so I have the social connections that I could rely on just at touch of my fingertips. But still, it's I want to meet new people and go out and do things, and I feel super privileged that that's my only problem right now. So it's
So I have a question for both of you guys, and this kind of ties into getting back to normalcy, right? Um, Once the stay-at-home gets lifted, do you think that there's going to be a crazy surge to go out and do things, right? To go out and try to get to the bar, and people. I think there's kind of like a boiling kind of social need almost, and it's kind of reaching like a tipping point. I think when I have a buddy who thinks that once all this kind of gets lifted, that everyone's going to go out and go kayaking and go do things that they, wanted to do or regret not doing.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts on that?
Maybe I'm hoping that we can lift up restrictions slowly so that pressure goes down slowly too. So for example, I think we lifted restrictions on outdoor activities like golfing.
Yep.
Um, so hopefully that would alleviate some pressure, and so we won't have a sudden surge of new cases. But who knows, maybe.
That's an interesting point, and I think it's going to be conflicting, and the messaging is going to be key because I think you're right, Scott. I think there is this sort of the boiling temperature within all of us where we're ready to explode, and once we get the green light, we're all going to be sprinting out to the things that we always wanted to do and the things that we miss. But Ginny's right in saying that, it's not going to just be the floodgates open one day. It's going to be measured. So it's going to be okay, like now you can go do these sort of things, and a week later it's going to be you can go do these sort of things. And if the messaging isn't precise and accurate, we're going to get to stage 3, but when we should be confined to stage 1. And I wonder if the messaging isn't accurate, if that could exacerbate the problem.
Yeah, yeah, the messaging is absolutely key right now, and I think um, we'll start seeing restrictions lifted very slowly. And like for example, maybe with gyms, they'll only have a certain number of people that they admit at a certain period of time. Maybe sporting events might have restrictions, but this is for you, men, with your policy degree. I don't know anything about this.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we talk about messaging all the time, and the city of Minneapolis, like we've changed the language already from social distancing to physical distancing because, that just seems more accurate. Like at a time like this, social connection and community and making sure we support each other, that's paramount. It's really, we want people to be physically distant. And so they've begun changing the language that way. I'm actually working on a communications campaign right now with the Minneapolis Health Department because people haven't taken physical distancing as seriously, and people are seeing, like I've seen this personally where people drive their trucks to the park and they all park next to each other, and for
Mm,
some reason, I don't know the psychological thing that's happening, but t to them, it might be a group of like 15 people like right next to each other, and that's still physical distancing to them because they're at the park. So it's almost like this weird psychological thing that happens where like, we're not at the bar, we're not at the movie theater, we're at the park where it's spacious and we're all like in the correct area, but they're not still not doing it right. And so we're working on like how do we message to youth because a lot of youth were still playing basketball at the parks in Minneapolis, and
mhm.
so like how do we get that message across where like this we're all in it together and this thing still matters.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's tough. So no other big tough changes for you then.
No, I really just miss seeing people, and I'm really fortunate that's the only tough change I've had.
Or like for in terms of kickboxing,
Mhm,
because like I come from the world of team sports, so I played football and mostly basketball, and so like you can do your drills by yourself and all of that, but you really can't do the core activity without other people. When it comes to kickboxing, we talked about a little bit at the front end of the episode. What is that like for you?
So I've got to admit that I haven't attended my kickboxing online classes as much as I probably should have. I've been really focusing on just conditioning, so that's just running, body weight exercises, stretching, and stuff like that. But how my coaches are doing it right now is that they're really encouraging us to shadow box and do the specific drills at home, follow along on Zoom and whatever. And but at the end of the day, if you want to get good at fighting, you have to fight, and so you can't fight yourself. It's sure you can shadow box and you can practice your drills and whatnot, but fighting is so reactionary, and so without another like hand trying to hit you, or without you trying to recover from getting hit, it's very different.
Hmm.
And
What's the
so
process? What's the process like for when you are sparring someone? What's the process like for drawing up an opponent? Who makes that decision, and how much time do you have to train?
mhm.
Do you know this other person? Is it from another gym, or could you just talk about that really quick?
Yeah, so like to be clear, I only do smoker fights. So smoker fights yet. And I was hoping to do a tournament, but that got canceled. And so I haven't had any professional fights, but usually the way it goes is that you get informed about a month or so and you have to cut a specific amount of weight. A lot of fighters just solely cut body water weight. So they go through this huge dehydration process. They won't drink any water the day before weigh-ins. And usually you fight a person from a different gym.
Okay.
And so I've known friends who fought other people in gyms in Wisconsin
Hmm.
or something like that. Surprisingly, I feel like Minnesota has a pretty vibrant fighting community, and
Hmm.
so we there's always like a ton of fights going on, and it's a hard process. It's unlike fighting is unlike any other sport that I've ever tried. It's really something else, just because you can train for it and like you could do whatever you can, but there's always going to be small little hiccups. And if your opponent gets one good hit on you, sometimes that can make or break a fight. It's really dangerous, but also like you don't feel more alive and then
Hmm.
it's
What's a smoker
fantastic.
fight, Ginny? I don't know what that is.
Yeah, so a smoker fight is usually for people with less experience, usually. And it's kind of like an impromptu fight. So usually the way it goes is that there's not the weight cutting process isn't as intense. So I for my last smoker fight, I fought at 143 pounds. And I actually came in underweight that day, but it was fine. They brought in someone with roughly similar experience, roughly similar weights. And also, it's not as at least the smoker fights that I've been in, it's not as serious. So if it becomes clear that one opponent is clearly dominating the other, they'll end the fight. And one key difference is that it doesn't go on your record, and also there are no winners and losers. It's
Hmm.
just basically a demonstration of two people who fight at roughly equivalent weights.
That's really cool.
Just almost to get experience without. It's just purely just to get experience, right?
Yeah, purely just to get experience.
Huh.
And I love fighting and everything, but I there's this whole mental game and the whole weight cutting process that I can't imagine myself doing on a regular basis. I think my plan was to do one tournament, and then I would like I have no dreams of becoming like a professional fighter or anything like that. I gotta be in school.
Yeah.
And even at the amateur level, you have fighters who treat this like it's their job. Like they're at the gym 5 hours a day, and they're devoting all their time, and they have strict diets. And I really like my desserts and breads, so I can't,
Yeah.
can't
Oh,
do
I
much.
love carbs.
Mhm. Yeah,
Wow.
That's
so it's
that's
great.
funny. That's funny. I'm glad that, you can't think of any one big thing that has changed to make your life tough. That's that's encouraging to hear. And I don't know you super, super well, but it just always, you've always seemed to me as a person that's disciplined and is good at sort of controlling your own environment. And I think maybe some of those skills have played into, why you're not feeling too much pressure and you don't feel too much disruption. Um, and so I'm glad to hear, this whole crisis hasn't sort of flipped your life upside down. But I think you as an individual, you deserve a lot of credit be
Oh,
because of
thank you.
that too.
Yeah, I guess so. I try to I take comfort in routines. So every morning it's about the same, and it's really helped me keep myself grounded. So yeah, I guess so.
That's great. I'm gonna ask you, I'm looking at the clock here and I want to let you go soon. So I'm gonna ask you one more sort of question that we've been asking everyone. But before I ask that question, knowing that you study sort of immigrant populations and things like that, can you maybe highlight where this scenario might disproportionately impact sort of migrant communities?
Yeah, I haven't looked into that too much, but I think this pandemic is highlighting how much health disparities that we actually have. We've known these things, these health disparities existed in the United States for the longest time. It's well documented. However, the fact that a lot of our immigrant communities are tied in with the supply chain and how we some of these essential workers are immigrant communities, it's really just pointed out the obvious to a lot of the public. And it's really unfortunate that a lot of our the racial disparities in the fatality rates with COVID-19. I forget the exact statistics, but in Wisconsin, for example, a good proportion of people who've died from SARS-CoV-2 tend to be Black or African American, whereas the actual like population of Black and African Americans in Wisconsin is it's not even the same. And so, yeah, I really don't know. Hopefully, there'll be more resources allocated for health disparities, but we'll just have to see.
Yeah,
Hmm.
hearing you speak, I mean, it just sounds like, it's the same tune as normal. Like we know immigrant
Mhm.
populations and migrant populations are traditionally underserved or don't have access to the same resources as the general American public when it comes to healthcare. And this might just be just on the same track. The same things are happening.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I guess we'll just have to wait and see what happens. Unfortunately,
Hmm. Hmm.
and that's just how it is right now.
Yep, yep,
I was
yeah.
just thinking about how that's an interesting question, man. And just kind of getting back to just messaging, right? How do you package all that up, um, support those communities, but at the same time mitigate any kind of spread of any harmful thoughts and xenophobia and racism, right? Like things that are not productive for a community or a civilization.
Hmm. And yeah, maybe this pandemic will actually make it worse for some communities. Like we see a lot of racism towards Asian Americans right now, and even me, for example. Although I haven't explicitly felt anything, I am more aware of like how I look, and I try not to clear my throat in public or like whenever I go grocery shopping. So it's a little you're a little on nerve, to be honest, or at
I'm
least I
so
am.
glad you brought that up because, I don't get to, I don't know, like, I don't know how many times you've talked about that with other people. And this is like the fifth COVID episode that we've recorded for the podcast, but I'm thinking about changing the order and having yours come out sooner rather than later. And so I don't really know how to phrase this, but like in a previous episode, quote unquote, I had just brought that up too, and that was sort of my first time saying it out loud because I brought up like, being Asian American, at least on the totem pole of ethnic minorities, we have a lot of privilege. And so
Yeah, exactly.
I've never had to like walk out and think like, no one thinks I'm gonna steal that woman's purse. And like our
Mhm.
black and brown friends don't have that privilege where, if it's 1 a.m. in Minneapolis, and you're walking on the sidewalk and you see a black or brown person coming towards you, you sort of tense up, but that's not necessarily the case when I cross paths with that person. And so this is sort of the first time in my life where when I go on walks and when I go on runs, I make sure I put like sunglasses on and think
Yeah.
about how I'm coming across. And I don't know, man, it just sends so many thoughts and emotions through me, and I don't know how to articulate it perfectly, but I'm so glad you brought that up.
And I think, we live in the greater Twin Cities area, and we're surrounded by, very liberal, progressive friends. But I was actually talking to my mom and dad the other day, and they're actually legitimately scared about how other people will perceive them, just because my mom and dad, they can't speak English very well, and they've already had then they can't describe it very well either, but they've said that they've experienced like people, looking at them in grocery stores,
Hmm.
and mom would just try to like make herself as small as possible and like try not to get noticed by people. But yeah, it's just scary for other Asian Americans, especially people who don't have resources to like actually articulate themselves very well. So it's
Yeah. And
yeah.
just the grocery store is so good, or example is so good because, I would intentionally take paths that are less concentrated. So like
Mhm.
I know the cereal aisle is over there and I can make a more
Yeah.
direct line to it, but I'll go around and get other things and then kind of go to the cereal aisle if I see that there are already like three shopping carts in there. And so like
Mhm.
those sort types of reactions, like I've never had to calculate for. So it
Right.
does make me feel worse for my peers, my black and brown peers. And it's unfortunate, but like I would rather prevent a confrontation than to like have pride and be like, like I'm not the issue here, and like go
Mhm.
into the cereal aisle and even take that risk.
Yeah. And another thing is that I feel like Asian Americans, we have a lot of privilege and we've taken advantage of that privilege. But, this is bringing out that that privilege could be taken away just like that by other white people. And so I'm really hoping by the end of this, Asian Americans can be more aware of their positionality and see who, like, what the actual problem is. And that's pervasive racism by predominantly white people.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so we'll have to see.
I'm so glad you brought that up because that made me, because you see it in on social media, you see it in the news, but when it's delivered that way, it's so easy to say that's not me, and so
Mhm.
to sort of have that conversation with you, not face to face, I guess, but kind of face to face, it just I don't know, it just makes it more real, and it makes me feel like I'm not in it alone. So I'm really glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, yeah. Happy to.
Yeah. All right. Last question, really quickly. What will the new normal look like when this is all said and done?
I don't know. Hopefully Medicare for all, but that might be too optimistic. Um, Maybe a greater appreciation for the healthcare field, nurses, people at the front lines. Hopefully the postal service will still be here. I really have my fingers crossed for that. And benefits for gig workers. Hopefully. I'm being very optimistic right now, and yeah, that's all I can think of off the top of my head. Maybe we also realize that some meetings could be sent by email, and make things less harder for us.
Yeah.
I,
Oh, dude, that last point about email meet. There's so
uh,
many meetings where just like, we show up, there's maybe like a group of 10 of us, and one person asks a question, and they're like, maybe three solid responses. I'm like, that couldn't
yeah.
been done by email.
So hopefully, no more unnecessary meetings. But
Amen.
beyond
Amen. That's the key takeaway. Let's end on that note. That's the key takeaway. No more
that,
unnecessary meetings. Think a
yeah.
little bit. Can I do this over maybe a 10-minute Zoom call or an email?
Yeah, maybe Zoom calls will be more used now. So who knows?
I hope so, man. Oh, well, Ginny, thank you for joining us. Thank you for teaching us. A lot of these conversations, we've sort of taught each other through personal experiences, but you were sort of able to enlighten us a little bit more on sort of technical stuff and, stuff that might inform, what our government leaders do. So I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me, guys.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I thought that was awesome to be able to dive into like all the stats and I think Min and I when we took the break we were like, wow, that was an hour, but very constructive stuff. That again is just we're very lucky to have someone like you on to kind of give your because you are kind of on the cutting edge here with even though I know you probably it's not your exact focus, but again, it's being referenced in the classes, and again, there's a lot of influence from the U of M. So, a very interesting opportunity, and just kind of touching on that last conversation there, it was just again interesting to hear perspective on, I guess understanding between race, right, and just understanding between the thought that goes into that, and as a white privileged male I think part of that privilege is ignorance and blindness to a lot of that. And again, being able to hear it, I think it is important, and I think it is interesting, and I think it's something a lot more white people could learn from if they take the time, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, Ginny, you used the word positionality a little bit ago, and even as we were talking, I noticed like how Scott was just giving us space, and that says a lot about you, Scott, that you gave us the
Yeah.
space and airtime to talk about that. And then, when Scott brought up like we really appreciate your expertise, and you're saying like, like this is not my specialty, but again, like positionality to us, you know a lot
Mhm.
more about this than we do, and so to for you to be able to share, all the work that you've put in, like as absorbing knowledge is hard, and so you have put in the time, but for you to try to boil it down to an hour and a half conversation, that really is a gift.
Mhm. Yeah, it's been fun, guys. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, hang in there. I'm gonna hang up and I'm gonna wrap up this and hang up, and I just want to debrief with you. But thank you for listening to the Quality Under Pressure podcast. You can find us on Twitter at QUP Podcast, on Facebook and Instagram at Quality Under Pressure, and you can email us at qualityunderpressure@gmail.com. Bye. All right, stop recording.